Good morning, everyone from Washington, D.C., and good evening to our friends in Seoul. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and it's my honor to welcome you all to the 2020 Atlantic Council Korea Foundation Forum. There are certain charms to actually being in the room with each other, and we've enjoyed that so much over the years. But there's also some efficiencies and social networking that takes place when you can't do it that way. And so we've got a great group that we brought together and a wonderful set of speakers. We at the Atlantic Council are delighted to be holding this annual event with the Korea Foundation for the first time under the leadership of Dr. Gun Lee, who became president of the foundation in September of 2019. So Dr. Lee, we are just delighted to be working with you as you've taken that important position. We're grateful that the Atlantic Council is continuing our important partnership with the Korea Foundation under Dr. Lee's leadership at a time when the US ROK alliance and economic partnership is becoming more important than ever. We're also lucky to have Kurt Campbell as our keynote speaker, and I'll have a conversation with him as well. With the move to a Biden administration, there's going to be a host of very important changes and very different approaches to international policy. And we're going to be lucky to hear from him. This forum continues to serve as a premier platform for gathering a high-level group of current and former officials and experts from the United States and the Republic of Korea to advance compelling discussions on the most pressing issues facing the US ROK alliance and economic partnership, and to produce innovative and actionable solutions for the strategically complex times we live in. This year's forum comes at a particularly important period for the alliance, and one that perhaps will be remembered as an inflection point in history. I compared it to the periods after World War I and World War II, where US leadership was decisive after World War II in a much more positive sense than after World War I, clearly. Come January, the United States will have a new administration, as I said, that is committed to continuing to work closely with Korea as a linchpin in the US relationship in the Indo-Pacific. And President-elect Biden has correctly described it in a recent phone call with President Moon as such. As I talk to leading members of the Biden elected administration, so much of their emphasis is on working with close allies, working with close friends, particularly Democratic allies around the world, and of course, particularly in the Pacific. We find ourselves still mired in COVID-19 pandemic, we perhaps more deeply so than you in South Korea, but we find ourselves now facing this at the same time that we're still facing in North Korea with greater nuclear capabilities than before. And all this comes at an uncertain time for the US-China relationship, which has been, which is probably at its lowest point in decades. The momentous set of challenges our alliance faces today is precisely the reason we've gathered here from Washington and Seoul for this virtual edition of the Atlantic Council Korea Foundation Forum. Integrating the voices of our allies and partners to develop actionable policy recommendations and innovative strategies is at the center of the mission of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security's Asia Security Initiative, led by Dr. Mian Oh. And she has organized today's conference with our friends at the Korea Foundation. She's been a terrific leader of our Asia Security Initiative in the Scowcroft Center, and we're delighted to have her as one of our central leaders at the Atlantic Council. Given the fantastic lineup of speakers that we have at this year's forum, I have no doubt that it will shed light on a number of possible ways forward for the future of the ROK alliance. And this is an important time. The beginning of any new administration is important for the United States. I would argue that this one is of particular importance for reasons that you'll hear from Kurt Campbell. Before we move on, I would like to remind everyone that today's event is open and on the record. We'll be taking audience questions throughout all of today's sessions. So please feel free to submit questions on Zoom or via Twitter using hashtag ACKF. So hashtag ACKF. For those of you on Zoom, please keep a close eye on the chat as we'll be sharing the link to our conference landing page there. And you can put questions also in the Q&A function on Zoom. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Glyn Lee, President of the Korea Foundation. Before joining the Korea Foundation, Dr. Lee was Professor of International Politics at the Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University, and also headed another think tank, the Korea Institute for Future Strategies, between 2003 and 2007. He's a current member of the Global Future Council of the World Economic Forum, which he previously chaired. During his impressive career, Dr. Lee has made significant contributions to US ROK relations through his scholarly writing, his considerable scholarly writing, especially on Korea's soft power, as well as through regular media commentary and government consultations. Most recently, Dr. Lee published a particularly impressive report in March advocating for Korea to use its liberal model of COVID-19 pandemic response for diplomatic engagements and for strengthening cooperation with other countries on emerging technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. As a US ally in this area of strategic uncertainty, Korea's diplomatic initiatives in the region have certainly grown and will become ever more important. Thus, we're most fortunate to be working with someone like Dr. Lee at this critical time. You're a true asset to US ROK relations, and perhaps we can make a deal as you can come out to the United States and help us with our COVID-19 situation. And we'll see if we can get you some vaccines a little bit, greater volumes a little bit faster. I'm just joking, but it just underscores his knowledge in this field and also the Republic of Korea's key role. So Dr. Lee, over to you.
Thank you very much, President Camp, for your very, very kind and nice introduction of me. Colleagues and friends all over the world, as President of the Korea Foundation, it's an honor and pleasure to welcome you all to the 2020 Atlantic Council Korea Foundation Forum. President and CEO Frederick Camp, Dr. Kurt Campbell, the Honorable Young Kwan-yoon, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and good evening. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all of you for joining this forum, despite your busy schedules and the time difference. The relationship between Korea and the United States has always been very important for peace and prosperity of the East Asia region. The US ROK alliance is not only about security, but also economic prosperity and sharing liberal and universal human values. It is indeed an old friendship built on mutual trust. Today, we are experiencing a very special moment in history. COVID-19 has changed every life down to the smallest details. As a result, we cannot gather together in one place and shake hands, but at least we can talk to each other without worrying about jet lag. Unfortunately, this barrier to people exchanges has brought about so many obstacles to economic well-being, as well as social and political activities, both domestically and internationally. International cooperation has been nearly invisible. Nationalism is rampant all around the world, and too many people are suffering from poverty, disease, and human rights abuses. Our efforts to rekindle international cooperation must start from creating a safe, stable, and effective global vaccine supply system to overcome the current pandemic. And afterwards, we can move on to other important international projects, just as we have done together before the pandemic. Vaccines will open the door once more to people exchanges, international collaboration in various fields, and active diplomatic engagements. I hope the new Biden administration will lead the world in vaccine distribution so that we might build back a better rules-based international order. Considering the significance of the 138 years of our diplomatic ties,
experts in US ROK relations are willing to lead in this transitional moment to seek a better future, not only for the bond between our two countries, but also for the global community as a whole. To do so, we must try to understand and interpret the new era on a basis of solid science and evidence, and think over how our two nations can coordinate to carry out future-oriented policies. Uh, in this sense, today's forum is a suitable place to begin considering the next step in our bilateral relationship. Experts from both countries will be discussing the future of the alliance, denuclearization of North Korea, new kinds of partnership, including economic cooperation, and hopefully digital democracy, strategic corruption, cybersecurity, climate change, and cooperation in space. Through our two-day discussion, we should gain a better idea of how we can navigate the new world together. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Myeon Oh and the staff of the Atlantic Council for organizing this online seminar. Please also allow me to thank all our distinguished participants from the US and Korea, who generously took time out of their busy schedules to share their precious ideas here today. Once again, I would like to thank President Kemp for very nice introduction of me, and stay positive and test negative. Thank you very much.
I think you've just delivered the quote of the whole session. Stay positive and test negative. So we're going to write that down and we're going to tweet that out. But Dr. Lee, that's a wonderful quote for our age, I think, and bumper sticker for cars in both of our countries. So as we stay positive and test negative, I want to move on. Thank you for those significant opening remarks. And I want to turn to the keynote speaker for this year's conference, Dr. Kurt Campbell. Yeah, people often introduce an individual by saying there is no one better to speak on this subject. Well, folks, there really is no one better to speak on this subject. Full disclosure, Kurt's a personal friend. Full disclosure, I've been stealing his ideas for years. He's one of the top strategic thinkers on a lot of matters, but obviously on this region, he is the best in the game. He's currently chairman and CEO of the Asia Group, a strategic advisory and capital management group that focuses on the Asia Pacific. He's as well chairman of the board for the Center of New American Security, one of the institutions in our field that I respect the most. He's a non-resident fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, vice chairman of the East-West Center. Previously, Kurt was U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2009 to 2013. Make sure that I have all those because I think you may have served beyond that, Kurt, but let me know if not. In any case, a lot of people hold that title, but he filled that title with a huge amount of substance, was a key architect to the policies during that period of time, and was uniquely influential in that role. We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts, Kurt, on what the years ahead will hold for U.S. strategy in the Indo-Pacific, for the rules-based international system, and particularly when it comes to the U.S. ROK alliance and relationship. After his opening comments and remarks, I'll invite our audience to submit questions as well, and I'll ask some of my own. Obviously, we're interested in what will almost certainly be a dramatic shift in tone in the Biden administration. Interesting to think about what kind of shifts there will also be in substance. But Kurt, let me turn over to you. I think you're still on mute. Roger, how do we take Kurt off mute? Or Kurt, do you need to do that yourself?
I think I'm good now. Is that good, Fred?
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you. Sorry for the technological glitch there. I think that's one of the great, only real challenges as we, wait for our turn to speak. First of all, Fred, let me thank the Atlantic Council, the Korea Foundation, Dr. O, Dr. Lee. It's tremendously important that you're convening at this time, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you as you go forward here. Let me put a few things on the table of what we might want to expect and think about the challenges that we're facing currently. Let me say that when Fred talks about the challenges that the United States are facing for Korean friends, there are the obvious challenges like the pandemic and issues associated with the economic recovery. For some of the reasons that Fred and Dr. Lee indicated, I'm actually relatively confident and hopeful that over the course of the next 6 to 10 months, American ingenuity, working with allies and friends, we're going to be able to finish off this pandemic much better than we've started it. And that will be a result of our ingenuity, our capacity, and again, as Dr. Lee indicated, listening to science. I think the real challenge for the United States going forward, and in some ways different than the periods that Fred indicated, is that I'm not sure that the United States has ever been this divided politically. And I want to just say something to Korean friends that may seem unusual, but true. Note how many Republicans in Washington have acknowledged that President-elect Biden is indeed President-elect Biden, an incredibly small percentage. So the idea that everyone understands that President-elect Biden had a substantial victory, nearly 80 million votes, but still there are many people in the political domain of the United States, very senior people, that have not acknowledged that. And that is a harbinger, that is an indication of what lies ahead, which will be a deeply divisive period. And my hope is, of course, we have perhaps the best person for this period of time, a man who has made his career reaching across the political aisle with deep friendships with people like Senator McConnell. The hope is that that will be able to overcome what has been sort of learned traits, primarily in the Republican Party, about how to deal with compromise and working across the political aisle. That's our biggest challenge, ladies and gentlemen, is whether we can summon a degree of domestic consensus to continue to play our role on the global stage. And I believe that the key variable and ingredient in that is that there is a broad bipartisan agreement about what we need to accomplish in the Asia Pacific region going forward. And let me lay those out quickly for our discussion today. First, I think there's a recognition that the United States has, in many respects, overinvested in the Middle East and South Asia over the course of the last 20 years. We've spent an enormous amount of blood and treasure and strategic engagement at a time where I think most recognize that the lion's share of the history of the 21st century is actually going to be written in Asia. And so you saw this at the beginning of the Obama administration, it continued in the Trump administration, and it will pick up speed in the Biden administration, which is this shifting of focus, this rebalancing more to the Asia Pacific region, because that's where the action will be. And I think you will see that in many respects, both strategic attention, but Fred and Dr. Lee, perhaps most importantly, is the building of capacity. We have enormous numbers of people that can tell you how to drill a well in Helmand province. But frankly, we're still just building that capacity for what will be necessary to be successful on the terrain that really matters in Asia. And that means understanding trade. It means understanding culture and history and the strategic dynamics of the region that are playing out in front of us. So in addition to this sort of rebalancing and this focus that is going to continue as we go forward, you're also going to see a number of other, I think, subtle innovations, as Fred has indicated. One will be a much greater focus on allies and friends, not just in the Asia Pacific region. I believe in that context, South Korea will play a very prominent role. We've always enjoyed a good relationship with South Korea, but again, as Dr. Lee and Fred has indicated, no country has stepped up more in playing a role in terms of global citizenry as South Korea. And I think we intend to work closely with South Korea and other countries in Asia to expand on those early experiences. So you're going to see not only attempts to enhance bilateral relationships with the various allies and friends in Asia, but an attempt to link them more together, not just the Quad, but going beyond that to link other nations into that grouping. But more importantly, and this is a long-term endeavor, is an attempt to link European allies and friends with Asian friends to talk about issues of strategic import, like China's role on the global stage. Now, people often throw this in as something that will be relatively easy to do. I think we all understand the cultural issues. This is not something that's ever really been undertaken. It's extremely important. It will take time, but it's critical that the critical allies of Asia work more closely with the key states of Europe. And I think the United States can play a linchpin role in that effort as we go forward. I think you're going to also see the United States, and again, we will rejoin most of the international organizations and also support some creation of new ones. Organizations are challenging. They have to put down deeper roots. They come and go, but I think it will be critical to understand that the institutionalization of Asia, critical organization, whether it's the WHO, elements of the East Asia Forum, ASEAN Regional Forum, they all seem like alphabet soup to many of us, but there are critical importance in bringing countries together to talk about common issues and actually to mediate issues of concern among key states as we go forward. The key ingredient in all of this will be what kind of relationship the United States will have with China. And I just want to underscore that there is a tendency among administrations to disregard and to distance themselves completely from the experience of the previous administration. I must say that is what the Trump administration did. Anything that the Obama administration did by almost definition was thought to be inappropriate or improper. That would be a mistake for an incoming administration. I think we have to look carefully at elements of the Trump administration approach and understand what things can be built upon and seek some elements of bipartisanship in Asia. I think President Trump and his team were correct in articulating areas of China's assertiveness, aggressiveness, and seeking to undermine the status quo in ways that would favor Beijing but harm other countries in Asia. We have seen a different China under President Xi, much more assertive, much more prepared to harangue and undermine our friends. What we're seeing in Australia currently is deeply troubling. South Korea has experienced that as well, as has the Philippines, Japan, and Wolf War diplomacy in Europe is well understood. So I think the United States is going to seek to continue to understand that the dominant watchword of the relationship between the United States and China will be competition. We intend to compete. That competition will begin at home, and it will involve key involvement of our allies. But a competitive relationship, a clear-eyed assessment will be critical. But I think what we will try to be, what the Biden team will try to be, will be steadier, more predictable. I think work more closely with other countries, not be as ad hoc and deeply unpredictable at times as President Trump has been more generally. I will say that when people say that we're going to compete where we must and cooperate where we can, it sounds easy. Like, yes, of course, we need to work together on climate change and on existential issues like the pandemic and proliferation, but it will be deeply challenging. As Fred will note to you, we have very little experience of this kind of mixed relationship of some areas of working together on global finance and economic and commercial exchange, and at the same time competing intensively in arenas like technology and the like. I'm actually quite confident that we can stand up the security or military challenge, but the dominant domain, and this is very different than the Soviet experience for the United States, will be in technology and high tech. And for the United States, that means adopting a completely new and well thought out framework, that we work with our allies, but be very careful and deny China certain engagement and access to key areas where we need to maintain a cutting edge in technology, whether it's in AI or robotics or 5G. And we can talk more about that as we go forward. Expect the US-China relationship to be complex. There are very few guardrails in the relationship. It is well known that the United States and China have not built the mechanisms of confidence building and crisis prevention. I would expect that we will have challenges ahead. Anyone who tells you that it will be easy to sort of manage and articulate the exact precision of a mix of cooperation and competition, I just don't think is paying attention. This is going to be the most difficult relationship that the United States has ever experienced. Much more difficult than the Soviet era relationship, which was monochromatic in comparison. It was existential, undeniably, but the challenge this time will involve every dimension of American life. Let me just conclude with this, though. There are always, that's a kind of a framework, Fred and Dr. Lee, about the way forward. There are always areas, unpredictabilities. And generally speaking, at the top of that list of unpredictable qualities and characteristics of Asia is North Korea. And one of the key challenges of the Biden administration is the need to make an early decision about what to do with respect to North Korea. What we saw at the Obama administration was a rather prolonged period of study. And during that period, North Korea took provocative steps that basically headed off any possibility of engagement with North Korea. What President Trump was prepared to do was extraordinarily bold strokes in his diplomacy. When I talk about areas that I think we need to emulate or admire, I think some boldness is appropriate in American foreign policy, particularly in Asia. But thinking carefully about what might be appropriate, working in consultation and partnership with South Korea, early signals to North Korea will be something that will be near the top of the list of the Biden team as they assume office, despite what some friends in Congress will tell you on January 21st. So look, our challenges are real. They're dramatic. I do want to conclude with one thing, guys. I travel a lot in Asia. I appreciate Fred's nice comments. I've spent a lot of time working in this region, basically the last 30 years. I'm deeply passionate about the US-Korea relationship. I've spent hundreds of trips to the region through all the many capitals. I know quietly in Asia, there are many concerns about American decline, about whether we're up for it, whether we're going to be able to continue to play our traditional role in Asia going forward. Let me just tell you my answer to that. This is not new. On many occasions in the last 40 years, there have been concerns about American staying power, whether we're going to pull inside ourselves or just retreat from the global stage, or that we're not able to compete in the way that we have in the past. We saw that during the Korean War, the early stages. We saw it during the Vietnam War in spades. We saw it at the end of the Cold War with the former Soviet Union, with Paul Tsongas, a famous senator from Massachusetts, saying the Cold War is over and Japan has won. We saw it during the Asian economic crisis, when there was deep worries about whether the United States would be able to continue to play a role. And we see it now during the pandemic. I will tell you, each time the United States was able to summon innate capabilities of reinvention, of purpose, of allied support to surge back on the international stage. I'm confident that we have that in us again. So those who have bet against the United States over the years have lost a lot of money, and I continue to believe that they will do so going forward. Fred, Dr. Lee, I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Kurt, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. You really hit on all key questions that I wanted to talk to you about, but that also gives me the opportunity to drill down a little bit more on a couple of those. Really, really useful comments across the board. As President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, you touched on something we would like to work on, and like as many of the things you talked about, it is easier to prescribe the solution than it is to actually execute it. So if one could really bring together European allies and friends with Asian allies and friends, it could be a game changer. And it could be a generational game changer. Negotiating with China with 25% of global GDP is different than if you're coming in with 60 to 70% of global GDP. And so I just wonder if you can talk about how, do you have a couple of specific ideas of
Yeah, I do.
where that could take place?
So let me just say this, and for friends in Korea, I do want to just underscore there is no one doing more innovative work and more committed to these cutting edge issues than Fred and the Atlantic Council. That's why I was so pleased to be able to do this morning. So I'm grateful for his hosting. I'm grateful for being invited, but I'm most appreciative for the work that they're doing. And this is the most important topic. Let me just say to all Asian friends, just something of critical importance. Everything that the United States has ever done of real strategic importance on the global stage, we've done with Europe, everything. And I believe a successful rebalance or pivot or focus on Asia will not be an exception. So if you look at everything, whether it's issues out of area, issues within Europe, climate change, the Maghreb, just go down the list. Fred and the Atlantic Council give you a better list. So we have what I would describe as the essential ingredient, which is long-standing habits of cooperation. We know how to talk about issues. We know how to work together. We have the established forms to do so. Number one. Number two, Fred, back a million years ago when I was an assistant secretary, I did a lot of dialogues with Europe. And I will say they wanted to talk about Asia, but it was sometimes uncertain, sometimes awkward, sometimes a little bit resistance. That period has passed. I think most European countries are also busy pivoting themselves to Asia. They know that that's where the future lies, and they want to work more with the United States. I also believe that some of what I would call overly, it's not naive, but assessments about how China really operated that animated a lot of European discussion and commentary. I think that period is largely over. I think many misconceptions or hopes have yielded to a more realistic assessment about the challenges of working with modern China and a recognition that comparing notes, working together will be of critical importance. And so I think there's much more desire among the key states to work with the United States and others in Asia about issues of common purpose. But it's not just China, it's climate change. It's issues associated with what's going to happen to the global trading system, a number of things. We can't be too overambitious, Fred. We have to have a key first couple of agenda items to get to, and we have to decide on what the right forums are. But I will just say that I believe the willingness and the framework is there. Bridging those alliance and partnership discussions will be challenging. I do not believe it will be easy. It will take time. Asian policy is about patience. There's nothing that can be done overnight or should be undertaken overnight, but the process will begin, and I believe that it will be a successful one over time. So I think when you talk about this being a path-breaking period, if one of the enduring features of the next 4 or 5 years is a robust, continuing dialogue and engagement between Europe and Asia with the United States at the center, that will be a successful accomplishment and achievement going forward.
Thank you for that, Kurt. Let's stick with this for 1 minute because this really is an area where we can make a difference. One of the more difficult areas to make a difference in, but one of the things that would be most useful would be trade. And if you look at RCEP that was just announced, if you look at the Trump administration in its earliest days pulling out of TTIP, and you could really imagine this is a place where you could put Europe and Asian free trading countries together. On the other hand, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, if they agree on one thing, there's some skepticism right now toward trade agreements and moving forward on trade agreements. Is there any promise? Is there any hope here?
Yeah, Fred, it's the right question. You've laid it out exactly the right way. It's a fascinating issue that I think probably one of the most important issues to understand is going to be the importance of trade into the 21st century in terms of prosperity, innovation, and the like. But the dominant platforms of both political parties have some real apprehension and concern about whether trade is appropriate, whether it can be undertaken fairly. I think the real issue, of course, you want to have good trade agreements and the like, but ultimately is going to be elements associated with retraining, uh, 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 refashioning jobs and economies that are affected by global trade. And here, the United States has just fallen down very badly. Asia is actually not much better. Germany and other countries in Europe have done a much better job at that retraining. I think that's an area that I think Democrats and Republicans are going to have an honest discussion about going forward. I do think that it's going to be difficult to lead from the outset with a new initiative or a new way. I was a big supporter of TPP at the time, Fred. I'm not currently believing that that's something that anyone could anticipate or think about out of the gate of any administration. And I do think the point that you made has to be a clarion call. It's not really a Sputnik moment. It's a more enduring thing. But the fact that China has done two things in the last 3 weeks should be a real wake-up call to us. One is that the signing of RCEP, which is more far-reaching than I think we anticipated, and although it was not authored by China, it is going to be dominated by China. And then, following that was President Xi's intention to potentially join TPP. That's a big deal. That's a very big deal. And we're going to have to think about responding. So and again, this is the point that we have to make to friends more generally. Our ticket to the big game in Asia is our military presence and our ability to deter and to prevent challenges to the operating system, if you will, of Asia. Fred, I think we can do that. And I think we can innovate, and we are a martial people, and we've got lots of experience. We're going to be able to do that. Are we going to be able to enhance our diplomacy, do the right thing in terms of engaging, bringing people together, right forums, along the lines that you're talking about with Europe? Yes, I believe so. I believe there's the appetite, the willingness, and the time is right. The real issue for the United States is what are we going to offer in terms of our economic and commercial engagement? The United States is by far and away one of the largest strategic investors in Asia. But what is our vision for an optimistic, open trading system? What are going to be the watchwords for global commerce, for technology, for issues associated with what are the frameworks for 5G and the like? The United States has to be in the game on those issues. Withdrawal behind our borders is just not an option if we want to continue to play a leadership role.
Thank you, Kurt. Let me turn to the Director of our Asia Security Initiative, Dr. Mian Oh, for a question she'd like to ask for you.
Oh, thank you so much, Fred. And thank you, Dr. Campbell. It's an honor to have you for our annual forum with the Korea Foundation. You mentioned the importance of going beyond bilateral linkages between the United States and Korea to link allies and partners across the region. So I'd like to ask you a question about Korea-Japan relations. And there seems to be a large degree of consensus in Washington, D.C. and the international community on the importance of improving relations between the two countries. How do you see the Biden administration approaching this issue? And do you think the US government should play a more active role helping them improve their relations, or is it a matter of sovereignty that the two countries should handle without US stepping in?
Thank you, Dr. O. And can I also, Fred, just say a word of how impressed I am with the work that Dr. O has done with the program, and really appreciate the efforts she's taken to integrate this into a much broader arena. She is ambitious for your program and also for the U.S.-South Korea relationship, which I'm grateful for. Let me just say, I think this is a central question. And I think Asian specialists and others who work in Asia are divided on this. There is one view that suggests that, look, these are two democratic friends and states. They're in a terrible quarrel. It's probably affecting both, obviously, their bilateral relations, their strategic interests, but in some ways, it's none of our business. And I think that would be the traditional view. I would probably put myself in a different camp, and I do not believe it is in the strategic interests of the United States to have our two closest allies working at such cross purposes. I believe this undermines American purpose. I believe it undermines allied solidarity on the issues that matter most, including North Korea. And I believe that there are reservoirs of goodwill in both countries that can be tapped into. And, I think that there are potential roles for outside groups, including the United States, to potentially play a role. I'll just leave it at that. I don't think more needs to be said at this juncture. But Dr. Ohl, I do think the lingering political impasse that Seoul and Tokyo find themselves in has now gotten to a place that even the skeptics in both countries find themselves deeply worried about the future. And I think that's an unsustainable course.
Terrific question, Mian, and thank you for that answer. We're down to the last couple of minutes. I think because you focused, as you did, on China, and I think you're right in highlighting that as the most difficult relationship the U.S. has ever had to navigate, ever experienced, and the Soviet relationship being monochromatic by comparison. Many of our closest allies have China as their number one trading partner. They are not going to want, and I'm not sure, I think South Korea may be in that same position. I know Japan is, I know Germany is, UAE is, Saudi Arabia is. How do we navigate what looks like an economic decoupling, to a certain extent, technological decoupling from the U.S. And our relationship with our allies in coming to China, given this economic situation? And this gets to a question that Politico has asked through the questions, which is, as you talk about the Biden administration not wanting to discard everything of the Trump administration, on China policy, what should they adopt and what should they discard?
Look, at the top of the list is just a clear-eyed assessment. Anytime you come to power, you recognize that the circumstances has changed, and there is no going back to a status quo antebellum. That's just not possible. And so it's going to be extraordinarily important. I actually wrote a book about transitions many years ago that no one ever read, with Jim Steinberg, my colleague and friend, called Difficult Transitions. And what's most important, as if folks return to government, is to understand how much the circumstances of Asia have changed just in the last 4 years. So, for instance, 4 years ago, one of the countries that had the strongest relationship with China was Australia. Currently, Australia is in the midst of an extraordinarily deep and divisive set of issues, politically, strategically, economically. And it will be important for the United States to understand how much the environment has changed and how assertive China has been in a variety of issues, not just the South China Sea, but the Indian border, all countries neighboring China and across Europe that we discussed earlier with Wolf Warrior. The management, the integration of areas where we will ring fence certain technologies, 5G, robotics, AI, other high-tech areas from certain kind of foreign, particularly Chinese engagement, and at the same time manage complex relationships that have high-tech components with key countries, particularly like South Korea, is the challenge of the next period. Fred, anyone who tells you that they have a precise recipe book for how to do this, again, I just don't think is paying attention. So I do believe there will be areas of continuity between the United States and China in which certain areas of technology the United States will seek to protect And there will also be areas that we're going to want to double down in cooperation with certain other countries to create, like South Korea and others, to create comparable capabilities that will compete with China more generally. Ultimately, I think the hope is this, though, Fred, that I think the essential approach of the Trump administration was to try to take China on alone, to stand off against China alone. And I think the differential with the Biden team will be to compete and confront China as part of a large association or armada of like-minded, strategically linked states. And the idea will be to present China, in some respects, a choice. Either adopt and change from some of avaricious activities that we've seen over the last many years, or face a engagement of like-minded states that are determined to confront it across the board.
Kurt, that's a terrific place to end. An armada of like-minded states. I like that image, and I think it's one that will be difficult to navigate, but I'm not sure there's another better solution. We've had a number of other questions from Radio Free Asia on North Korea, but you answered it. Other questions I saw come in, you had answered in your comments and your other answers. This has just been a terrific start to this annual gathering. Kurt, thank you for your engagement. Thanks to the audience for joining us. We're going to take a quick break now before we start the first panel at 9 a.m. For those who are joining us via Zoom, please check the chat for a link to the conference landing page. The Zoom session at this moment will now close, and we'll see you all in the next one. So again, thanks to Dr. Lee, and thank you so much, Kurt Campbell.
Thank you, Fred. Best to everyone. Thank you.
Hello, annyeonghaseyo, and welcome. It's wonderful to be with you and to be joined by such an impressive panel of speakers to discuss the future of the US alliance with South Korea under the incoming Biden administration. I'm honored to have with me today 5 distinguished guests whose impressive biographies I'm going to shorthand only for the sake of time. We have Dr. Young Kwan-yoon, who served as the Republic of South Korea's Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2003 to 2004, and is now Professor Emeritus at Seoul National University. Dr. Jim Miller, who was US Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from 2012 to 2014, and is now President of Adaptive Strategies, LLC. Dr. Jae-chun Kim, who is a Professor of International Relations at the Graduate School of International Studies at Sugeng University. Mr. Barry Pavel, who everyone knows is the Senior Vice President and Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security here at the Atlantic Council. And Dr. Hung-kyu Kim, a Professor of Political Science and Director of the US China Policy Institute at Aju University. My name is Olivia Gazis, and I cover intelligence and national security for CBS News. Because other panels during this summit are designed to drill down on specific topics like North Korea, we'll begin today's discussion with the big picture. And to that end, it might be helpful to start by having each of our panelists examine some of the preliminary diplomacy and the public messaging that's taken place to date. So I'll pose this question to all of you. According to call readouts, President-elect Biden has personally conveyed to President Moon several things. 1, his intention to maintain the United States defense commitment to South Korea. 2, to take steps to strengthen the alliance. And 3, to engage in principled diplomacy vis-a-vis Pyongyang. These readouts have used the word linchpin to describe Seoul's regional role and used the phrase shared values repeatedly. And in a clear swipe at President Trump, Biden also said in an unusual op-ed that he would cease, quote, extorting Seoul with reckless threats to remove our troops. So Minister Yoon, if we could please start with you as a professional diplomat, what is all this public messaging signaling to you about the likely priorities for the Biden administration, and how are they being received in Seoul? Minister Yoon, if you could please unmute your line, that would be helpful.
Sorry.
Perfect. No problem.
First of all, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the organizers of this conference, especially to Dr. Frederick Camp of Atlantic Council and President Lee Gun of the Korea Foundation, also Dr. Oh Mi-yeon of Atlantic Council too. I think President Biden's message is very well received in Korea. His message is reassuring in the sense that, frankly speaking, in the past 4 years, many Koreans felt, somewhat uncertain about the stable alliance relationship. So I think it's a good message and encouraging message. But I think a lot of issues that we have to do in coming months between two governments. I think, I hope both governments would open a kind of close consultation, a high-level consultation about the future of alliance relationship. And because alliance was established 7 decades ago, and the situation nowadays is very different from that time. And we have very different international and domestic situations these days. So it is important and urgent to establish a kind of common vision for the future of alliance between two countries, which will serve as a guideline when we discuss all the important alliance issues, like how to denuclearize North Korea, SMA, negotiation, OPCOM transfer, something like that. So I think it is, also it is very reassuring to hear Dr. Campbell's message, because he mentioned about that. He mentioned that the Biden administration will probably make an early decision about what to do North Korea's nuclear issue. I think that's very, prudent and wise, thing to do, because we don't have much time, in dealing with nuclear issue properly. I think this is an important issue between two countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Yoon. Undersecretary Miller, maybe we can turn to you for your thoughts. And I'll add one angle, which is obviously the cost-sharing negotiations surrounding the American troop presence on the Korean Peninsula was a significant source of strain on US-South Korea relations during the Trump administration. So if you could offer us your sort of bird's eye view, and then also your view on that specific question and how you expect it to be addressed in the Biden administration.
Sure, Olivia, and many thanks. And thanks to the Atlantic Council for sponsoring this important event. I would say two things in particular about the US-South Korean relationship from the perspective of the Biden administration. First is perhaps the most obvious, and that is that President Biden will work to ensure that the US is a reliable partner, that we're a trusted ally, that we sustain our presence that the nuclear umbrella is credible, that we work together effectively on trade, not just bilaterally, but multilaterally, that there are no sudden changes. And of critical importance, I think, that President Biden will work to establish bipartisan support for this approach so that it is sustainable within his administration over time. Second, and this is a reflection of the reality of the position of the United States today, and it is different, as Kurt Campbell pointed out, than it was in 2009. I think and expect the Biden administration will work to establish a balanced partnership. The U.S. will listen to the Blue House. The U.S. will also expect South Korea to continue to strengthen militarily, including with advanced systems and technologies, and to continue, as it has done so well, to sustain and even expand its regional and global role. And that includes a role for U.S., South Korea, and others in institution building in Asia and globally. So I think those would be the two themes I would expect in particular from a Biden administration. And on the question of costs, mostly I would expect a very different process. And that is one in which U.S. senior leaders and South Korean senior leaders come together, have a very direct discussion about appropriate burden sharing, and having something that's perceived as fair by both the South Korean people and the American people is fundamentally important, not just for the moment and for political ratings or for public opinion, but for the sustainability of the alliance. I think we've got a very strong basis over decades of working through these issues. And when the senior leadership sits down together and works them out together, we've been successful. That's the approach I would expect a Biden administration to take.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller. And if we could turn to Dr. Jae-chan Kim, would you please share with us your view, including what areas of the US-South Korea alliance might be the most in need of rehabilitation? Maybe you could address a little bit how shaken, to the extent it is, South Korea's trust is in the US after the tumult that it had experienced in the previous 4 years.
Well, there is really a little doubt that Trump's transactional approach did significant damage to the alliance. So, overall, Biden's messages are being very well received in South Korea. We believe and we hope that Biden can reverse the Trumpian approach. Biden certainly understands that alliance is a strategic asset of the United States, not a liability. I remember Biden saying a number of times that he would rebuild the American international standing with the help of American allies. I think that's the right approach. Biden also signaled that he would take a more principled approach to North Korea. I welcome that change as well. Trump met Kim Jong-un 3 times when there was no evidence that North Korea was up to the task of denuclearization, which I think was a huge reward on the part of Kim Jong-un. Trump boasted that he preserved peace on the Korean Peninsula because he and Kim Jong-un have maintained a very amicable relationship. But the truth of the matter is that at this very moment, North Korea is still accelerating nuclear capabilities. So it's not really a genuine and sustainable peace. I personally believe that bottom-up approach is the more appropriate approach now. Of course, China, I think, will be the most important foreign policy priority to President-elect Biden. But even in China policy, Biden pledged that he would bring allies to this fight against China. So I think it's urgent for the Biden administration to restore some semblance of normalcy in alliance policies to implement more effective China policies. So overall, I think Biden coming to power in the US will create a more favorable environment for both countries to resuscitate this very important value-based alliance, which I think has been in disarray in the past 4 years.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. Barry and Mr. Pavel, if we could turn to you now for your sort of opening thoughts and where you would expect the Biden administration to start its work. But I also want to read to you a quotation from Antony Blinken, who's the president-elect's nominee for Secretary of State, just because I think it speaks to kind of the mindset that this administration may go into its foreign policy with. He said that we are living in a time of shifting power and alignments among nations. nations, a huge diffusion of power away from states, and a growing questioning of governance within states. Tremendous economic, demographic, technological, environmental, geopolitical change that we're all experiencing every day. And in fact, the rapidity and pace of change is such that I think there's a general sense that we've lost our North Star. So Barry, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about how the US-South Korea alliance adapts to that kind of worldview, and anything else you'd like to add given the previous speaker's remarks.
Well, thank you, Olivia, and thanks again to our partner, the Korea Foundation. I want to key off of something Minister Yoon said, which I thought was really important. He said we need to establish a common vision for the alliance. And I fully agree with everything all of my other fellow panelists just said. I do think we're in a very different era of history. And I thought your quote from Secretary nominee Blinken was a perfect one. The challenges are growing. I see three big ones for the alliance, but the opportunities are growing as well, and it's highly dynamic. So I think this is the time I would start early on doing a joint strategic reassessment of the alliance's future. The two countries' teams should get together and look at and assess the landscape, the geopolitical landscape, and all the other elements. And I think three big challenges will pop out of there. Obviously, North Korea continues to be a challenge and a threat. China is increasingly a challenge across a wide range of domains, and including the ideology domain, which means it's a threat to democracy if the democratic world doesn't get together more, as Kurt Campbell said they will. And then lastly, the pandemic. We hope it's over. We hope vaccines will be the end of this, but they'll be increasing in frequency for reasons that we can discuss. So the alliance needs to adapt because military tools remain critical, but there's a wide range of other tools that are also essential to deal with China and to deal with pandemics. South Korea has modeled a lot of some of these non-military tools. And so I really think it's an enormous opportunity for the alliance to catapult in many areas to global leadership. So there is the basics that we need to do, more military capabilities, strengthen deterrence of an increasingly nuclear capable North Korea. But there's a wide range of other things that we can do together based on a reaffirmation of our shared values, which continue to this day. And remembering the blood we spilled together in the Korean War, and that we're willing to sacrifice again if the conditions suggest that we will need to do so to protect our two countries.
Thank you so much. And if now we can turn to Dr. Hyun-Kyu Kim, would you please share with us your thoughts on what's been raised so far? And it seems as though China is a recurrent theme. So perhaps your thoughts on that will serve as a good segue to our next topic as well.
Yeah, I think the South Korea-US alliance has been the strongest alliance ever in the world for the last 65 years. Although there was ups and downs historically, this alliance has illustrated an unbelievable degree of resilience. However, during the Trump administration, South Korea faced four dilemmas: choosing side dilemmas, confidence dilemmas, precarious peace-building dilemma, and the decoupling dilemma. The trust and confidence of alliance has been seriously damaged, and these four dilemmas could become a vicious cycle in a worst scenario. The South Korea-US alliance at the crossroad at this moment, I think. Balance and strategic communications are very important to recover the confidence of the alliance at this moment. It is good to see President-elect Biden continues to send the signals he would pay special attention to alliance to strengthen it. However, I think it is premature to be optimistic for the future of alliance. The President-elect Biden faced tremendous domestic turbulence and also self-help international chaos left by the Trump's foreign policies. So South Korea will carefully watch over the progress of the domestic politics in the United States, even though Biden or his camp expressed several ideas on how foreign policy can be, but it's still long time to execute this kind of policy. So still we have to see what's going on there, and then this is my current observation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. And I'll just remind everyone, as one programming note, we do invite our audience to submit questions, which I will be glad to ask as they come in. I'd like to stick with China and reference again some remarks made by Tony Blinken, the nominee for Secretary of State, because he said that competition with China is fine if it's fair, and that engaging with China in areas of shared interest, like climate change and global health, is possible when the US is operating from a position of strength. Both he and Jake Sullivan, who was nominated to, who will be the national security advisor to the president-elect, have said that US-China competition may be less a question of bilateralism than it is one of relationship and alliance building throughout Asia. And that's something that you've heard Dr. Campbell say as well. So I'd like to pose this first to Undersecretary Miller and Mr. Pavel. If we could start with you, lay out for us what you expect the dimensions of the Biden administration's approach to China might be, and where relationship or alliance building with partner countries is going to rank. And then I'll just add, what regional relationships do you think are the most in need of rehabilitation at this time? Undersecretary Miller, let's start with you.
Okay, great, Olivia. I'm going to somewhat reiterate what you just said from administration policy and add just a little bit. I think that you can think of the US-China relationship to have 4 dimensions. The first is competition, and that includes trade and especially includes technology. Kurt Campbell highlighted this. Technology is the driver for economic advantage as well as military advantage, and expect the US to push harder to control technology going to China. I think it needs to be very selective, but also to work closely with partners to advance our own technical advantages. And so that will involve stopping IP theft, strengthened but narrowed export controls, and also dealing with the competition geographically and having an effective approach to the Belt and Road Initiative, which the Trump administration began to take on, not particularly effectively in my view, because it tried to do so unilaterally. And perhaps most importantly in this competition is the competition of ideas and of ideology. It is clear that Xi Jinping believes that China provides a more effective model for other countries to emulate and is attempting to use that model to influence not just affairs domestically, but globally. And so the US succeeding domestically is fundamentally important to its succeeding in that competition as well. That's one dimension, competition. Second is deterrence, and that will continue to be important vis-a-vis China, North Korea, and others. And it implies a continued US military presence and deterring coercion or aggression. Third is cooperation and climate change, pandemic response, and preparedness for the future, non-proliferation. As Dr. Campbell said, these are easy to say. We should cooperate, harder to do, and it will take thoughtful work to make that happen. And the fourth element, which really applies back to all of the preceding 3, is coalition. And that is that I expect the Biden administration to seriously work to strengthen our alliances, to strengthen our partnerships, and to have those be balanced and sustainable. It's not a return to 2009 or some prior date. It's looking forward and to work to establish coalitions globally, including strengthening of international institutions as well as partnerships and alliances that are sustainable, not just in a Biden administration, but for the future. And then Olivia, with respect to regional priorities, let me say at the outset that the US-South Korea relationship remains fundamental, and I think it is fair to call the linchpin of the US posture, not just militarily, but economically and politically in Asia. Of course, the relationship with Japan, with Australia are also fundamentally important. And if we swing around from the Northeast Asia to the Indian Ocean, the relationship and the role of India globally, I think is going to be fundamentally important. And building bridges, not just US, Indian, but building bridges with other democracies, including South Korea, I think will be very important for the future of this largest democracy in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Mr. Pavel, do you want to add to Dr. Miller's observations?
Thank you. Well, he handled it so well. I mean, I agree with every word. Just a couple of additional thoughts. And I like the way Jim framed it, as always. You know, I think it's worth going back to Kurt's mention that the Biden team will approach these things with a bit more steadiness and a bit less volatility. And that has a way of helping to build the coalitions and to strengthen the alliances, you know, all by itself. You don't have to worry about the next, kind of lightning bolt coming across the atmosphere. It is worth reiterating that we have a common vision and a common assessment of the key challenges. And I think the challenges that Jim started to lay out that China presents, based in ideology, based in Kim Jong-un's strong drive that the authoritarian, technologically enabled model is the model for all countries. He's exporting that model. He's exporting the technology and being aggressive across a wide range of domains. I think we have to have lots of conversations between US and Korea and between, among other like-minded countries. But I do think overall the Biden approach will steady the ship, which will help with, I think, Jim's really important point. China is best handled when it presents challenges multilaterally. China prefers to deal with countries one-on-one, but the most effective way to counter that is to get countries together and present a united front. The question of which relationships need rehabilitation, well, I think as you might expect, most, if not all of them do. The ones Jim mentioned are critical. I do think Southeast Asia becomes a much more important region going forward over the next few years. I do think the US-Korea alliance can be a leading alliance. Why don't the US and Korea collaborate on engagement in other regions, in countries in Southeast Asia? And the one other point I would make is that India really does loom larger and larger. I don't think the Himalayas tensions are going away. I think that that's going to fester for quite a while. We don't want that to get too hot and to turn into a real war, but it is an opportunity for countries to help India, to provide any capabilities that might be useful, to discuss it diplomatically. It is sort of another area where we can help to bring India into a broader set of coalition democratic relationships that is essential for handling the broad range of challenges that China presents.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pavel. I want to pick up on an important point you made on multilateralism. And despite China's preference of dealing with countries one-on-one, one of the priorities for the Biden administration, as we heard discussed by Dr. O and Dr. Campbell, might be to try to boost or to restore trilateral cooperation among the US, South Korea, and Japan. So Minister Yoon, I wondered if you would share your thoughts with us about your sense of the Moon administration's openness to those kinds of discussions, insofar as the Biden administration might view those as a potential counter to China in the region.
I think there is much room for both allies to cooperate on various issues, which was mentioned my colleagues here. If we look at the history of alliance between the United States and South Korea, it has developed from Korean Peninsula-centered security alliance toward a regional and economic and even global alliance these days. So there will be many common issues to talk about, to discuss with each other. So there are much room for cooperation in the future. And South Korea is a state whose identity as a state is based on such values like democracy, open market, multilateralism, or rule-based international or order, something like that. So there are, common values between two countries to be shared and to be further promoted in global politics. on the issue of trilateral, cooperation between South Korea, the United States, and Japan, I think that's very important issue. And in promoting cooperation among three countries will be in the national interest of South Korea too. One reason, why there were some difficulties in managing Japan-ROK relations in the past several years was mainly because first, Prime Minister Abe's historical revisionism. That could not be accepted by ordinary Korean people. The second reason for the difficulties was different perception of China's threat. Geopolitically, Japan and South Korea have different geopolitical strategy or positions. South Korea is different from Japan in the sense that we have North Korea. Japan has no North Korea, North Japan, actually. We are a divided country. We Koreans want to establish a permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula, and which we need a cooperation from China. So we have this kind of unique agenda as a country, as a peninsula, which is located between China on the one hand and the United States and Japan on the other. So how to harmonize those issues, those difficulties between two countries. And that's an important issue. And I hope the United States will continue to play some kind of important role in establishing better bilateral relations. Actually, our government, President Moon Jae-in's government, recently, has been trying to improve our relationship with Japan. So I think I'm optimistic about the future prospect of trilateral relationship. In terms of dealing with China issue, we South Koreans have a difficulty in the sense that China, after becoming confident as the result of the rise of their power, aims to weaken bilateral alliance between the United States and ROK. But ROK is facing imminent threat of North Korean nuclear issues or some conventional military threat, etc. So we need a strong alliance. So we have to deal with that kind of geopolitical differences between the geopolitical conception of China regarding Korean Peninsula. I think there will be some ways of dealing with those issues.
Thank you very much, Minister Yoon. I think you encapsulated very well the geopolitical complexity that Seoul in particular faces in having to find ways to cooperate with both Beijing and Washington. And I'd like to ask Dr. Jae-chun Kim if you could address the question of the Quad Plus, because one of the many consequences of the pandemic was the genesis of this Quad Plus, a meeting of like-minded democracies in the Indo-Pacific that grew to include South Korea. If the Biden administration were to show interest in continuing this arrangement and growing it, how do you think Seoul would respond, especially after, as one example, the acrimony surrounding the deployment of the THAAD missile defense system? How big is the appetite for provoking Beijing and Seoul?
So far, the Moon Jae-in government has been a little bit hesitant to cooperate with the American Indo-Pacific strategy for fear of angering Chinese, as you mentioned. But I think the Moon Jae-in government should be more open-minded to this Indo-Pacific strategy, because the way I see Indo-Pacific strategy is Indo-Pacific is the concept of region that has been on the rise since early 1990s. The talk has been there in policy-making circle, in academia, as to why we'll have to invent this new regionalist concept, Asia-Pacific. So the Moon government should understand that before Indo-Pacific is American strategy, Indo-Pacific is the concept of new regionalist that has been on the rise. And the Moon Jae-in government, there is a fear that Quad Plus might develop into a new type of Asian NATO here, and the sole purpose of Indo-Pacific strategy is to besiege China, which I really don't think is the case. I think Indo-Pacific strategy, as was Asia rebalancing strategy, has multi-dimensional dimensions to it. It's not just about military strategy to surround China. It's also about development, official ODA and equality and lifting extreme poverty in the region, particularly in Southeast Asia. And there is a lot in common between Asia-Pacific strategy, Indo-Pacific strategy and the Moon Jae-in government's new Southern policy, which wants to expand our foreign policy vision to Southeast Asia and to India. So there are a lot in common between Indo-Pacific strategy and Moon Jae-in government's new Southern policy. But I think one thing about Indo-Pacific strategy, I mean, if this strategy is going to present member countries in the region as to which country you'll be picking. Is it going to be the US or is it going to be China? It's going to make us very uncomfortable. So I think Indo-Pacific strategy will have to proceed in more sophisticated and nuanced manner to mobilize support from member countries in the region. I'm not sure whether I answered your question correctly.
No, absolutely you did. And again, highlighting the many complexities of security questions in the region elicit. I do know that there's another panel addressing North Korea, but there's an excellent audience question that's come in. It's from Marcus Garlaskis, the former National Intelligence Officer for North Korea and now an Asia Security Initiative non-resident senior fellow. Let me read it. Given the progress made towards transition of wartime operational control, the modernization of South Korea military capabilities, the rapid evolution of the North Korean threat, and the range of demands on US defense resources, is it not time to adjust the composition of US forces Korea? Other than the deployment of a THAAD battery, has USFK's makeup really changed in a significant way in a decade to keep pace with the situation? Don't we need to maximize efficiency and ensure the right capabilities are in place? Marcus, would be interested to hear whether the panel thinks such a change is appropriate and feasible. Undersecretary Miller, why don't we have you start with that question, and then we'll take others in turn.
Sure, it's a good and appropriate question, not just today, but at any point in time. And if we start by going back to Barry Pavel's excellent thoughts that the US and South Korea should have a common view of the security environment and of the challenges and opportunities, that should be the baseline for thinking about the North Korean threat and the posture on the peninsula as well. The reality is that 28.5 K is something that is sustainable for the United States. The number is not too high. It could go up, it could go down slightly. But the question is the force mix. And my view is that both the force mix for South Korea, which has shifted substantially towards more high-tech capability, including long-range strike, should continue. And that the relative balance for the US role should shift, but that it should be done in a collaborative way, not the United States coming in and saying, here's the way it's going to be. And so I think when we sit down together and have that conversation, a likely outcome would reinforce the US roles of providing global intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance and command and control in South Korea is improving its capacities there. It reinforced the U.S. providing long-range strike capabilities, some based on peninsula, some based off of peninsula, and having effective consultation processes about their employment. It would involve a sustained presence on the ground, but I do think that the nature of both the threat and the nature of from North Korea, which has declined in its conventional capabilities, and the nature of warfare has also changed, so that a shift in U.S. posture that has more mobility, more strike, and somewhat less ground forces, and counting on South Korea to provide a substantial a fraction of those, even in the worst scenario, would make sense. It's a slight adjustment. Both sides should work on it together. Both sides, in my view, should be shifting toward an understanding of modern warfare, including countering chemical weapons, including the ability to deter, if necessary, defeat nuclear threats as well.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Mr. Pavel, maybe you want to add a little bit to that, and maybe specifically on the question of UPCOM transfer and where you would expect the Biden administration to come down on South Korean military independence. Obviously, that dialogue got derailed by the pandemic, and President Moon has made it a priority for his administration. Maybe you can address that issue a bit.
Thanks very much, and I like the way Jim framed the question. I'll add a little bit more, but I do think it should proceed from a joint national security scoped strategic reassessment of the environment, both now and then. We need to use a little bit of foresight, like we try to do in the Scowcroft Center. So what's the environment now, and what does it look like going out to 2030 or so? Because we really are amidst a significant transformation of military capabilities among a lot of advanced countries. The US is mid-stride, or maybe in the early stages of that transformation. And so we want to make sure the alliance, and especially since Korea is such an advanced economic and technological ally, as Jim mentioned, we want to make sure that the alliance is also leading in this area, as well as in all the other areas. So that's how I start the problem. The other kind of going in assumption is, in other places and other times when a nuclear threat has become much more significant, alliances have adapted their posture. And there's lots of examples, including NATO, where there's strategic discussions, threat assessments, and then there's adjustments of the overall combined allied defense posture to deal with these new potential military capabilities by an adversary. It kind of hasn't really happened. North Korea now has a significant number of nuclear weapons. I think speculating here, post-COVID, are they going to look at biological weapons use even more? We don't know. So probably need to look hard at that problem. But I would think the force mix, which Jim rightly focused on, and to me, numbers 28,500, they're kind of irrelevant. We should get people more focused on capabilities that need to be there and capabilities that can be brought to bear along certain timelines. But I think the mix should include missile defenses, biological defenses, unmanned systems and counter unmanned systems, fifth generation tactical aircraft, cybersecurity. North Korea's capabilities have grown significantly there, and advanced cyber reconnaissance, smart sea mines, and a wide range of other things. And so I would look at the logic here as, what's the strategic reassessment saying? What's the force mix? And then once you're clear on some of those steps, then you go down to questions about OPCON transfer and related things. I think that needs to come at the end of those strategic discussions, which I hope would occur in the first half or so of 2021, as opposed to being an a priori decision before you go through those really important strategic bilateral discussions.
Thank you, Mr. Pavel. I will invite Dr. Hung-Kyu Kim if you'd like to add anything on this question of the composition of USFK and in the sort of ambit of evolving military capabilities by the North and in general. And then perhaps we can all pivot to a more specific North Korea question. But Dr. Kim, please.
Okay. during the U.S.-China strategy competition, United States tried to control the uncertainties, because in the meantime the uncertainty and instability dramatically increased actually during this kind of period of time. So I do not think United States put priority on the transfer of the outcome to South Korea. Moon Jae-in government's actually yearning for more autonomy in foreign policies and security because of the experience after SAD issues. And then Moon Jae-in really regards the retrieval of the outcome as the first step to do so. However, in the meantime, South Korea would increase its military preparedness against North Korean military adventurism and see more comprehensive collaboration with the United States. But if you look at the three conditions to render, outcome back to South Korea, it is almost impossible to achieve that kind of conditions. So it is a kind of a political decision. But the problem is there is difference of the maybe calculations and then between the United States and South Korea. So this is also issue of maybe a difference between Moon and then maybe Biden government. Let me briefly jump on the Biden's China policies. I think there are at least 4 different groups of China policies within Biden administrations. First one is the co-evolution group. Second one is the liberal institutionalist. Third one is the new way advocates. And fourth one is the domestic politics first group. China policies would be factored by these their interactions, and then also maybe big business lobbies within the United States, maybe transnational the business groups, and also domestic politics. But I think it is quite certain all of these different groups would not pursue a Cold War and all-out decoupling from China, which are quite different from the parlance of Trump's China policies. So Biden administration would not take China as an adversary, but focus on establishing a rules-based international order. So South Korea would welcome Biden's China policies if he executed such policies as I described. So South Korea would have a space and time to take breaths. We can find an opportunity to upgrade the South Korea-US alliance from the military-focused alliance to a comprehensive strategic alliance. We would welcome establishing a rule-based international order. North Korea would carefully watch over who is in charge on North Korean issues in the Biden administrations and how Biden's North Korea policies appear. Therefore, I think it is not likely for North Korea to make any provocation in the first half of 2021, which is quite different from the common anticipation. So it's a time for everybody carefully watch over how Biden executes his foreign policies, including China policies.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. You actually just raised an interesting question there, which is the likelihood that North Korea will engage in some kind of provocation early on in the new Biden administration. Some Korea watchers have said that it's a real possibility and that Chairman Kim may revert to provocation if only to garner some attention from the incoming administration. So let's have a sort of group discussion on this front. Let's start with Mr. Pavel, perhaps. How prepared is the alliance for de facto nuclear North Korea? And how likely do you think it is that Kim is going to revert to provocation in the early days of the Biden administration?
Well, I think the question of preparation, first of all, I sort of addressed in my previous remarks, and that is that I think coming out of the joint strategic reassessment that the two allies should do, we should, take a look at what capabilities might need to be adjusted, and we should do this together. This isn't the U.S., or Korea saying this is what has to happen, but I think this comes out of our mutual discussions, our sense of common threats and opportunities, our shared interests and values. I think it's really important to reaffirm those and to talk again as allies, which hasn't kind of happened as much as it should over the last few years. On the second question, far be it for me to suggest to our Korean colleagues on this panel whether I think that Kim Jong-un's going to engage in provocations in the first 6 months or not. I do think that Kurt Campbell's comment is really important, and that is, at least my take on that is, you know, the Obama position of an overall policy of strategic patience didn't really work. North Korea greatly developed its capabilities for quite a while. You know, the boldness, as Kurt mentioned, of the Trump administration trying a different approach didn't really work either. Obviously, things have not changed too much. We're glad that we haven't had as many provocations, but the threat continues to grow. So I think this is a good time, as Kurt was suggesting, for us to come together as allies and come up with maybe a little boldness, but boldness that makes sense towards the policy ends that we are seeking. This may be a problem that we can't solve, but we just have to continue to manage. So whether North Korea will engage in provocations or not, if I was pushed, I'd say they'll wait a little bit to see what the Biden administration says and does before trying to force it in one direction or another. But I don't know how long that wait will last.
Good. I was going to push you, Barry. Minister Yoon, perhaps we can toss it over to you. Two-part question. One is, to the extent there may be provocation, is there anything that the Biden administration could do to forestall such a provocation, messaging, outreach, back channeling? And second, to Barry's point and Dr. Campbell's point about this question of boldness, what might that kind of an approach look like vis-a-vis the North and involving the South?
Yes, first on the first question about the possibility of North Korea's provocation, I think there is certain probability of provocation, but I don't know whether what kind of provocation North Korea would make if the United States, the US government neglects North Korea's nuclear issue for some time. But one thing clear is that Chairman Kim Jong-un is eager to get out of economic difficulties, and he wants to resume nuclear negotiation with the United States. One concern for me is that President Biden may be busy handling all the difficult domestic issues and put aside North Korean issue for the time being. And in that case, probably there is a high possibility of provocation by North Koreans. So I think it is important for the US government to send a signal, in any form. It can be delivered quietly, or send a public verbal message, on the government policymaker level, that the US is ready to resume a negotiation as soon as possible. So don't hurry and make any kind of provocation or something like that. So delivering that kind of message as early as possible, I think that's an important thing for the US government to do. And what kind of bold approach the Biden administration can take in dealing with North Korea? I think that's an important issue. I think one big reason why US governments could not succeed in denuclearizing North Korea in the last 3 decades was mainly because they tended to neglect the typical issue of security dilemma. What I mean is North Korea is surrounded by big powers, and for example, in the early 1990s, when they began to develop their nuclear weapons, they were in a dire situation economically, in terms of security, in terms of diplomatic relations. And it wanted to, have a normal, diplomatic relationship with the United States. But both the United States and South Korean governments were not ready to embrace North Korea diplomatically around that time. So I think pressure only cannot work. There should be political engagement toward North Korea. And in that sense, I think, I hope Biden administration can pursue both goals at the same time. On the one hand, it should continue its sanction. It had better continue its pressure tactic against North Korea. But on the other hand, it may be able to pursue some kind of a political engagement, like declaration of the end of Korean War, or establishing liaison office in Pyongyang and Washington, D.C. All these measures have been regarded as a return for North Korea's denuclearization so far. But what I'm suggesting is that those kind of bold initiative from the American side will prepare a much better political environment for successful diplomatic solution of the nuclear issue.
Thank you very much, Minister Yoon. I'm afraid we're in the final 5 minutes of our discussion, so I'm going to ask one big picture question drawing on your remarks. I'll pose it to Undersecretary Miller, but perhaps we can squeeze in a couple of other responses. So to the extent that the Biden administration does attempt some sort of political engagement with North Korea or a different strategy, I'd like to ask, what, if anything, the Biden administration can do to convince its international partners that the initiatives that it is embarking on during this presidential term are going to endure? What lessons have U.S. allies taken away from their engagement with the Trump administration over the past 4 years? Is there a sort of whiplash effect that we're going to have to overcome? So what can the new administration do to persuade its partners and allies that there isn't going to be another large-scale reversal in its policy initiatives in 2024 or even in 2028? Undersecretary Miller, let's start with you. And if we have time, we'll add in a couple of other panelists.
Okay, great, Olivia. If I could, before I answer this final question, a quick comment on the North Korea questions that were just addressed. My view is we need both a back channel and a front channel being explicit negotiations, and Dr. Yoon has that, I think, right. We need to understand in both countries that the next step is not going to be complete denuclearization and look for a step-by-step approach. I think the Biden team will be tempted to look at the Iran model, which it will need to adapt, certainly. But some key principles like reversible for reversible, having snapback provisions for economic sanctions and so on will be important. And on counter provocation, I'd say we had pretty good processes after a couple of incidents during the Obama administration, including the Chonan. And I hope that those processes are still in place, if not strengthened. Okay, what can the Biden administration do? First, of course, just showing up and being reasonable will have some benefits, but that won't carry the day forever. I would highlight 3 points. First is, I think that they should acknowledge for the US that reversal is possible. Our allies globally and partners globally know that that's true. This was a significant win for President-elect Biden. but President Trump still got the most popular votes in history, aside from President-elect Biden, and still has a strong constituency. So they need to understand that a reversal is possible, that we are having significant challenges domestically. And what that means is that our ability to make progress internationally and get US public support will help reinforce the what I believe will be a realistic and positive American foreign policy. That's reversal is possible, and we need there are things that can be done to help. Second thing I would say that Biden needs to do is really look to get strong bipartisan support wherever possible, especially on foreign policy, economic policy, and defense. This has historically been easier internationally than domestically. The Trump national security strategy emphasized building alliances. Of course, Trump tended to do the opposite and tear down alliances and be an unreliable partner. But the strategy was to build alliances. So let's close that say-do gap and actually work to build alliances and partnerships. And the alliance with South Korea is particularly important. And third, I'm a Democrat, so this won't come as surprising. I think the third thing the Biden administration needs to do is to govern effectively within the United States, to show that a sensible approach to foreign policy can advance American interests, and to get reelected. And that will include, in the near term, knocking down COVID-19, growing the economy, getting it back on track, and dealing with racial, social, and economic inequality. For those who haven't read Jake Sullivan's piece in The Atlantic, I would recommend it to you. The emphasis on domestic policy as a pathway and critical enabler for foreign policy success, I think, is very important. I believe is correct, and the approach the Biden administration should and will take. Thanks.
I actually think that was a terrific way and a wonderful encapsulation of the challenges and the road ahead, Dr. Miller. So thank you very much. I am afraid we are out of time for this session. Thank you so much, 감사합니다, to our audience for joining us. And our thanks again to our panelists and to the Atlantic Council and the Korea Foundation for the opportunity to have this fascinating discussion. I will turn it over now to Dr. Mi-yeon Oh for closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you all for joining us for the first day of the 2020 Atlantic Council Korea Foundation Forum. It was truly an honor to have such a distinguished group of speakers from the United States and Republic of Korea together again for today's timely discussion. In closing, I would like to extend our special thanks again to Dr. Lee Gun, President of the Korea Foundation, our colleagues at KF, and of course, all of our speakers for helping make this first day such a success. I also like to thank everyone in the audience for tuning in virtually for today's event. We have another fantastic lineup tomorrow, including 2 more panel sessions. The first session will focus on principal diplomacy for denuclearized North Korea, and will feature Brookings Robert Einhorn, Seoul National University's Kim Byung-yeon, former NIO for DPRK, and our non-resident senior fellow Marcus Kalauskas, and the Institute for National Security Strategies, Song Ki-young, and CSIS Sumi Terry. The second panel will dive into the US-ROK economic partnership beyond the peninsula, and I will be joined by Desk for Korea and Japan, Mark Nepper, DCM of the Korean Embassy, Seung-hyun Moon, and Seoul National University's An Deok-keun, and the Council on Foreign Relations, Scott Snyder. Please join us again at 8 a.m. Washington, D.C. time and 10 p.m. Seoul time tomorrow. Thank you, and we look forward to hosting you again then.